The official courier envelope didn't feel like paper. It felt like a stone. I ran my thumb over the crisp seal, a seal from the county courthouse, and knew what was inside even before I opened it. The words on the page were cold, legal, and sharp enough to draw blood. My son, Julian, was petitioning the court to declare me mentally incompetent. His reason, my so-called erratic spending on the local children's home. He called my charity a sickness, my kindness a symptom. He wanted to take control of everything my late husband and I had built. He wanted to erase me. I read the document twice. My hand did not shake. A slow, cold smile touched my lips, a smile he hadn't seen in 30 years. I looked at the summons, then at the phone, and whispered to the empty room, "The fish is on the hook." Before we dive into what happens next, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a part of our story. We love hearing from you, so let us know in the comments where you are listening from today. I placed the court summons on the polished surface of my kitchen table, right next to the grocery list. The contrast was almost comical. One paper detailed a son's ultimate betrayal. The other reminded me to buy milk. I walked to the counter, filled the kettle, and selected a tea bag, my movements measured and calm. Outside, the afternoon sun warmed the crimson petals of the rose bushes I had planted years ago. For a moment, the world felt perfectly normal, and this document was just a bad dream. But it was real. I could still feel the phantom weight of the words. Incompetent, unsound mind, a danger to her own financial well-being. Each phrase was a carefully chosen dagger, designed to strip me, not just of my assets, but of my dignity. A familiar bitterness, cold and sharp, rose in my throat. This wasn't Julian, the boy I had raised. This was a stranger, wearing his face, a man whose greed had hollowed him out from the inside. He thought I was a foolish old woman, lost in grief and sentimentality, signing checks to St. Jude's Children's Home without a second thought. He saw my generosity, not as a choice, but as a weakness to be exploited. He believed I was an easy target, a problem to be managed, a bank account to be seized. He assumed my quiet life meant I was no longer paying attention. That was his first mistake. My life as an accountant had taught me that numbers never lie. And for the last 6 months, the numbers had been telling me a very ugly story. He thought this lawsuit was his opening move in a war he had already won. He had no idea I had been preparing for this battle for months. He had no idea this piece of paper wasn't his weapon. It was his confession. I picked up my phone, my fingers steady as I scrolled through my contacts. The first call was the easiest one to make. It all started 6 months ago, on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other. The sun streamed through the kitchen window, and the only sound was the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. For me, the first Tuesday of every quarter was a ritual, a habit ingrained from 40 years as an accountant. I would sit down with a fresh pot of coffee and the financial statements from the investment fund my late husband, David, and I had so carefully built. It was my way of staying connected to him, of honoring the life we had planned together. At first, everything looked normal. The market had its usual ups and downs, but then I noticed it. A line item, tucked away between dividends and capital gains, labeled simply as administrative fees. It wasn't a large amount, just a few $1,000s, but it was there on the previous quarter's statement too. And the one before that, my fingers grew cold as I pulled out the files from the past 2 years. There it was, on every single statement, a slow, steady bleed, small amounts, meticulously calculated to fly under the radar. I spent the next hour with a calculator and a legal pad. The numbers grew, page after page, until they formed a sum that made my breath catch in my throat. $480,000. Gone, vanished into thin air, through fees I had never authorized, and depreciation losses that made no sense. My first call was to the investment firm. I kept my voice even, professional, asking for the authorization documents tied to these fees. The portfolio manager was polite, promising to email the paperwork immediately. 5 minutes later, it arrived. I clicked open the PDF, my heart pounding, a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. And there it was, a power of attorney form, granting Julian the authority to manage the fund's administrative details. Below the legal jargon was my signature, or rather, a clumsy, almost insulting forgery of it. A sharp pain, colder and deeper than grief, settled in my chest. It was the feeling of a foundation cracking, the one I thought was built on love and trust. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate, calculated theft carried out by my only son. The tears I expected never came. Instead, something else did. A familiar, cold clarity I hadn't felt since my last day at the firm. The mother in me was wounded, but the accountant was awake, and she understood direct confrontation would lead to denial and gaslighting. He would call me confused, mistaken, old. No, the only way to fight a liar is with facts, and I was going to build a fortress of them. My grief had a new name now. It was called strategy. The day after I discovered the forgery, I made 2 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to a man named Arthur Miller, a trust and estate lawyer who had been my husband's closest friend and our attorney for decades. I didn't tell him everything. Not yet. I simply said I needed advice on updating my estate plan. The second call was to a name I found through Arthur's network, a forensic accountant named Maria Chen. She specialized in uncovering financial fraud within families, a job that sounded as heartbreaking as it was necessary. In our first meeting, I laid out the statements on her polished conference table. I showed her the forged signature. I watched her eyes, sharp and intelligent, scan the columns of numbers. She didn't offer sympathy or shock. She offered a plan, and I embraced it. The plan was simple, yet deceptive. We knew Julian was siphoning money because he believed I was oblivious. His greed was his weakness. So we decided to feed it. With Arthur's guidance, I began to deliberately increase my donations to St. Jude's Children's Home. I went from my usual monthly check to funding a new playground, then a library wing. Each donation was a calculated move, a piece of bait dropped into the water. I knew Julian monitored my accounts. He would see these larger sums leaving, and it would trigger his greatest fear, the fear that his inheritance was being given away. It would force him to move from quiet theft to an open attack. He would have to try and seize control legally, and in doing so, he would walk right into our trap. While Julian was watching my donations, Maria Chen was working in the shadows. She was a ghost in the machine, tracing every dollar he had stolen. She followed the money from my investment fund to a series of shell accounts, and finally, to a personal line of credit Julian used for his extravagant lifestyle. The evidence she was building was meticulous, irrefutable, and damning. A month later, the inevitable happened. I received a phone call from a lawyer I had never heard of, a man with a smooth, condescending voice. He said he was representing Julian. He explained that my son was deeply concerned about my recent financial decisions and wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss my well-being. He called it a family mediation. I knew what it was. It was the next step in his hostile takeover. A cold sense of calm washed over me. I pictured a chessboard in my mind. He had just moved his knight, thinking he was about to checkmate me. He had no idea my queen was already in position. I agreed to the meeting without hesitation. The trap was set. Now, all I had to do was wait for the right moment to spring it. The law office Julian's attorney had chosen was cold and impersonal. The air smelled of old leather and ambition. I sat in a chair that felt too big for me, clutching my handbag in my lap. I made sure to sit with my back slightly stooped, my eyes downcast, playing the part of the confused, fragile mother they expected me to be. Across the polished mahogany table, Julian sat back in his chair, the picture of relaxed confidence. He wore a tailored suit and an expression of patient concern, a mask he had perfected over the years. His lawyer, a man with a practiced smile, began the meeting with empty pleasantries about finding an amicable solution for the family. I nodded along, saying very little, letting my silence be mistaken for weakness. Then Julian leaned forward, placing his hands on the table as if he were about to explain something to a child. He said, "Mom, we are only here because I am worried about you. Dad would have wanted me to look after you, to make sure you were safe." I felt a familiar sting at the mention of his father, but I pushed it down. I looked up at him, letting my eyes appear misty. "I just wanted to do some good." Julian, saying, "Jude's does such wonderful work for the children." He sighed, a theatrical sound of exasperation. "Of course, Mom, but your generosity has become excessive. It's not responsible. I'm just trying to make sure the family legacy, what Dad and you built together, isn't just given away to strangers." There it was, the confession, wrapped in the language of filial duty. My fingers brushed against the antique silver brooch pinned to my blouse. It was a gift from David, a small, elegant bird with a tiny sapphire eye. Julian never would have guessed that the sapphire eye was the lens of a high-fidelity digital recorder, capturing every self-serving word that left his mouth. He thought he was talking to his frail mother. He was actually giving a sworn statement to his own prosecutor. I let a single tear roll down my cheek, a final touch for my performance. I said, "Perhaps you are right. Perhaps I have not been thinking clearly." The flicker of triumph in his eyes was unmistakable. He thought he had me. He thought the fight was over. The meeting ended soon after that. I allowed his lawyer to walk me to the elevator, offering reassurances that everything would be handled smoothly from here on out. I played my part until the elevator doors closed, leaving me alone. Then, and only then, did I stand up straight. I reached up and gently tapped the brooch, turning off the recording. Julian walked out of that conference room, believing he had won. He had no idea I was leaving with his downfall secured in my pocket. 2 days after the so-called mediation, a thick manila envelope arrived at my door by special courier. It didn't bear a court seal or a law firm's letterhead. It was simply addressed to me from Maria Chen, my forensic accountant. I took it to my study, the one place in the house that still felt entirely my own, and sat down at the heavy oak desk David had used for years. The room was quiet, filled with the scent of old books and lemon polish. For a moment, I just held the envelope, feeling its weight. It was the weight of truth. I slid the contents out. It wasn't just a stack of papers. It was a story told in numbers, a 50-page narrative of greed and deception. Maria had done her work with the precision of a surgeon. The first section detailed the forged power of attorney, with a side-by-side analysis of my real signature and the crude copy Julian had used. The differences were glaring, undeniable. The next 20 pages were the heart of the report. Maria had created a flowchart, a visual map of my stolen money. It showed the systematic withdrawals from my investment fund, disguised as administrative fees. From there, the money trail wound through a ghost corporation Julian had set up, a company with no employees and no assets, before finally landing in his personal bank accounts. Every transaction was time-stamped, every amount accounted for, down to the last cent. The total at the bottom of the page was stark and unforgiving, $480,000. But it was the final section that made my hands clench into fists. Maria had gone a step further. She had cross-referenced the dates of Julian's largest withdrawals with his social media activity. The report included glossy, full-color printouts from his public profiles. There he was, grinning from the driver's seat of a new silver sports car. Posted the same week, a $50,000 transfer was made. There was a photo of him and his girlfriend on a balcony overlooking the Swiss Alps, captioned, "Living the Dream," dated just 3 days after another significant withdrawal. He wasn't just stealing from me. He was flaunting it to the world, using my life savings to fund a life of arrogance and leisure. I stared at the images, at the face of the son I thought I knew. The boy who cried when he scraped his knee, the young man I had sent off to college with such high hopes. He was gone. In his place was this stranger, a man so consumed by entitlement that he saw his own mother as nothing more than an obstacle. The report was more than just evidence. It was an autopsy of our relationship. It laid bare the sickness that had taken root in his heart. I closed the folder slowly. The grief I felt was real, but it was now overshadowed by a grim, unyielding resolve This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about accountability. With Maria Chen's damning report secured in my safe, it was time to set the second piece of my strategy in motion. This part of the plan was less about evidence and more about principle. It was about drawing a line in the sand so deep that not even a court order could erase it. The next morning, I met with Arthur Miller, my lawyer, in his quiet, sunlit office. I placed the forensic report on his desk, but told him to set it aside for a moment. I said, "Arthur, before we talk about that, we need to talk about my will." He looked at me over the top of his reading glasses, his expression one of patient curiosity. He knew me well enough to know I never did anything without a reason. I explained what I wanted. It wasn't a complete overhaul of my estate plan. It was a single, powerful amendment, a legal failsafe, a tripwire designed to detonate with the very next move Julian made. Arthur listened intently, his pen still. As I finished, a slow smile spread across his face. He leaned back in his chair and nodded. "Beatrice," he said, his voice full of admiration, "that is brilliant. It's aggressive. It's airtight. And frankly, it's exactly what he deserves." He spent the next hour drafting the document. It was called an irrevocable codicil to my last will and testament. The legal language was complex, but the core idea was brutally simple. It stated that in the event any legal action was initiated by my heir, Julian, to challenge my competency or contest my right to manage my own financial affairs, his status as a beneficiary would be immediately and permanently nullified. The entirety of the estate would instead be transferred directly into the St. Jude's Children's Home Trust Fund. It was, in essence, a self-destruct button for his inheritance, and his own greed would be the one to press it. That afternoon, we went to the bank and had the document formally notarized. The notary, a young woman with kind eyes, stamped the paper with a satisfying thud. As she handed it back to me, I felt a strange sense of finality. This wasn't just a legal document. It was a declaration of independence. For a fleeting moment, a wave of sadness washed over me. I found myself looking at an old photo on Arthur's credenza, a picture of David and me with a much younger Julian, smiling on his first day of school. I remembered the fierce, protective love I felt for that little boy. I wondered where he had gone, how the innocent child in that photo had become the callous stranger who was now trying to destroy me. But then I felt the crisp edge of the notarized document in my hand. The sadness receded, replaced by the same cold, clear resolve I'd felt before. This decision wasn't easy, but it was necessary. It was not an act of revenge. It was an act of preservation, the preservation of my dignity, my autonomy, and the legacy of kindness that David and I had worked so hard to build. The night before the court hearing, the house felt unnaturally quiet. The ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to echo the frantic pounding of my own heart. I had spent the day with Arthur, going over our strategy one last time. Every document was in place. The forensic report was copied and bound. The notarized codicil to my will was tucked safely in his leather briefcase. All the pieces were on the board, waiting for the game to begin. I was sitting in my favorite armchair, a worn velvet wingback that held the faint scent of David's pipe tobacco. When the phone rang, the caller ID showed Julian's name. A part of me, the mother that still resided in some forgotten corner of my heart, wanted to ignore it. But the strategist knew I had to answer. I needed to hear his voice one last time before everything changed. I picked up the phone. "Beatrice," I said, my voice deliberately soft. "Mom." His tone was laced with a thick, syrupy layer of false concern. "I just wanted to call and see how you were doing. I know tomorrow is going to be difficult. I want you to know this isn't what I wanted." I stayed silent, letting his words hang in the air between us. He continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Mom, it's still not too late. You can call this whole thing off. Just agree to let me help you manage things. Sign the papers. We can avoid all the ugliness of a public hearing. No one has to know." The audacity of it almost made me laugh. He wasn't offering an olive branch. He was offering me one last chance to surrender. He was so blinded by his own arrogance, so certain of my weakness that he couldn't see the trap he was walking into. He thought he was in control, that he held all the cards. He still saw me as a problem to be handled, a senile old woman to be placated. I let the silence stretch for a few more seconds, savoring the dramatic irony. He was advising me to avoid a public hearing, not knowing that the hearing was the very stage I had set for his downfall. He had no idea that the ugliness he wanted to avoid was entirely of his own making, and that I had a front row seat to watch it unfold. "I will see you in court, Julian," I said finally. My voice was no longer soft. It was calm, steady, and as cold as polished steel. There was a moment of shocked silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, his confident smirk faltering for just an instant. He had expected tears, pleading, confusion. He had not expected resolve. Before he could recover, I ended the call. I placed the phone back in its cradle, the finality of the click echoing in the quiet room. The performance was over. Tomorrow, the curtain would rise. The courtroom was exactly as I remembered from my brief time on jury duty years ago. Sterile, intimidating, and smelling faintly of floor polish and anxiety. I sat beside Arthur Miller at the plaintiff's table, my back straight, my hands folded calmly in my lap. Across the aisle, Julian sat with his lawyer. He gave me a brief, pitying glance, a final, silent offer for me to back down. I met his gaze without expression, my face a perfect mask of neutrality. His lawyer began, his voice echoing with practiced sincerity through the cavernous room. He painted a picture of a loving, concerned son forced to take drastic measures to protect his aging, confused mother. He presented copies of my bank statements, highlighting the large donations to St. Jude's. He spoke of my late husband and how Julian was merely trying to honor his father's legacy by protecting the family's assets from my supposed impulsive generosity. Julian sat there, nodding along, the very image of filial piety. When it was Arthur's turn, he rose slowly. He didn't approach the judge's bench with a stack of papers. He held only a single, slender document. "Your Honor," he began, his voice calm and clear. "Before we address the defendant's baseless claims about my client's competency, there is a preliminary matter we must bring to the court's attention. My client, Mrs. Beatrice Evans, recently updated her estate plan. We would like to submit into evidence this notarized codicil to her will, signed and executed last month." He handed the document to the court clerk, who passed it up to the judge. Julian's lawyer immediately stood up. "Objection. Your Honor, my client's mother's will is not relevant to the matter at hand, which is her current fitness to manage her finances." Arthur Miller simply smiled. "On the contrary, Your Honor, it is the only thing that is relevant." The judge peered at the document through his spectacles, his expression unreadable. He read it silently, his eyebrows raising slightly. He then looked down at Julian and his lawyer. He said, "Counselor, this codicil states that in the event your client, Mr. Julian Evans, initiates any legal action to contest his mother's competency, his status as a beneficiary of her estate is immediately and irrevocably terminated. By filing this very lawsuit, your client has, of his own volition, disinherited himself completely." A collective gasp rippled through the small audience in the courtroom. Julian's face went from confident to confused, then to a sickly shade of pale. His lawyer stared at Arthur, his mouth agape, utterly speechless. They had walked into a legal minefield they didn't even know existed. They thought they were holding a trial about my sanity. They had no idea they were presiding over the funeral of Julian's inheritance. The judge rapped his gavel lightly. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the stunned silence of the room. He thought the show was over. He was wrong. This was only the opening act. The courtroom air crackled with tension. Julian's lawyer was on his feet, stammering about undue influence and coercion, his composure completely shattered. Julian himself sat frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. He was still processing the first explosion, completely unaware that the second, much larger one, was about to detonate. Arthur Miller let the chaos settle for a calculated moment before he spoke again, his voice cutting through the noise like a razor. "Your Honor," he said, addressing the judge, "that codicil was not an act of malice. It was an act of self-defense. And the reason my client, Mrs. Evans, felt the need to create such a drastic failsafe is because she was already aware that she was being systematically defrauded by her son." He turned and walked back to our table. He picked up a second, much thicker folder. It was the 50-page forensic report from Maria Chen. He placed it before the judge with a heavy, deliberate thud. "This, Your Honor, is a full forensic audit of Mrs. Evans' accounts over the past 24 months. While Julian's lawyer sputtered, Arthur calmly summarized the report's findings for the court. He spoke of the $480,000 that had been methodically siphoned off. He presented the analysis of the forged power of attorney, and then he directed the court's attention to the large monitor on the wall, a screen that had been dormant until now. He said, "This report also contains a lifestyle audit." The first image that flashed onto the screen was a picture of Julian's new silver sports car, taken from his own social media page. Next to it, a bank statement showing a $50,000 withdrawal from my fund, dated the very same week. The next slide showed Julian on a ski slope in the Alps. Beside it, another transaction. On and on it went. Lavish vacations, designer watches, expensive dinners, a life of luxury, all paid for with my stolen money. The courtroom was utterly silent. The only sound was the quiet, damning click of the presentation remote as Arthur moved from one piece of evidence to the next. Julian had gone from pale to ashen. He wasn't looking at the screen. He was staring at me, his eyes wide, with a terror that was deeply, profoundly satisfying to watch. For the first time, he wasn't seeing a frail, confused old woman. He was seeing the architect of his ruin. The judge finished reading the report's executive summary. He removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, his expression grim. He looked at Julian, not as a son in a family dispute, but as a criminal defendant. He looked at the evidence of wire fraud, forgery, and financial elder abuse. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and laced with cold fury. He said, "Counselor, this is no longer a civil matter of competency. This is now a criminal investigation." He motioned to the bailiff standing by the door. The game was over. Checkmate. The judge's words hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. Julian's civil case against me was dismissed with prejudice, but that was no longer the main event. I watched as two uniformed court officers stepped forward from their positions by the wall. They moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency that was far more chilling than any shouting or drama could ever be. They walked directly to the defendant's table. Julian didn't seem to understand what was happening until one of the officers was standing directly behind him. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs being unfastened was the loudest sound in the room. He didn't struggle. He didn't speak. He just sat there, a hollowed-out statue of a man, as his hands were pulled behind his back. The arrogance that had been his armor for so long had crumbled, leaving nothing but a vacant, terrified shell. The judge wasn't finished. He addressed Julian's lawyer, his voice devoid of any warmth. He informed the man that his conduct would be reported to the state bar for immediate review, citing his willing participation in a clear case of fraud and elder abuse. The lawyer's face turned the color of old parchment. In one clean motion, two lives, built on deceit, were dismantled. I did not smile. I did not feel a surge of victory. I felt quiet. A profound sense of peace settled over me, the kind that comes only after a long and brutal storm. I gathered my handbag, gave Arthur a grateful nod, and stood up. I walked past the table where Julian now sat, head bowed, waiting to be led away. I did not look at him. He was a chapter of my life that was now closed, a book I would never open again. I didn't go home. I drove directly to St. Jude's. The afternoon sun was warm. As I walked through the doors, the sound of children's laughter filled the halls, a sound more valuable than any stock or bond. I spent the rest of the day in the library, reading stories to a group of 5-year-olds. At one point, a little girl with bright, curious eyes took my hand in hers. Its warmth was real. Its trust was real. I smiled. A genuine, unburdened smile. My wealth was never in a bank account. It was here, and for the first time in a very long time, I was truly rich. Yes, you should absolutely add an audience interaction segment. It is crucial for building community and signaling to the YouTube algorithm that your content is engaging. And that is the end of our story. Thank you for joining Beatrice on her journey. Her story reminds us that true strength isn't about the money you have, but the dignity you refuse to lose. We would love to hear your thoughts. What does real wealth and peace mean to you? Share your perspective in the comments below. If you were cheering for Beatrice's final move in the courtroom, type the word justice in the comments. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you can join us for our next story.